as a zookeeper, where I did a lot of wildlife and exotic animal training presentations and education. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. It is part of my presentation where I'll talk a little bit more about my experience and what I've done. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started on this slideshow here. And let me get it loaded up. There we go. Okay. So this is my presentation, Positive Training for Horses, which is what you all are here to learn about tonight. And I'll talk more about that picture as we go, because you're going to see it again. So I figured I'd start with a little bit of a summary about what the talk today is going to look like. I'm going to tell you about me, kind of why I'm the person to be giving this talk. We'll do a very basic overview of the science behind animal training. I'll talk a little bit about where traditional and sort of the new age and natural horsemanship training fall along the training spectrum. We'll discuss kind of the moral dilemma of training horses, an overview of positive reinforcement basics, some common issues that can be solvable in a positive way. I'll go over a couple of case studies. We'll talk about where to go from this talk specifically and in horse training in general. And then at the end, I will open it up for questions. So about me, as I mentioned, I'm a former zookeeper and exotic animal trainer. I've worked with a wide range of species and habitats. Worked for both SeaWorld San Diego and the San Diego Zoo and Safari Park. I've also been working with horses for 24 years now. That was fun math to do. I didn't believe it had been that long, but it has been that long. As I mentioned, I own Iron Oak Canyon Ranch, which is a horse boarding facility, but we also teach riding lessons. I personally teach training, horsemanship, and riding lessons. My facility offers beginning riding lessons as well. And we do some wildlife education as well. With my background as a zookeeper, I have some animal ambassadors that I use to talk about how to be a good neighbor to our local wildlife. My animal ambassadors now are of many different species. I'll introduce some of them in a few minutes just to show you again my background. I'm not currently riding horses for medical reasons. My personal interests now are more leaning heavily into bettering their husbandry, liberty, and what you might call trick behaviors, and advancing horsemanship through offering our horses choice. And I also consider myself an advocate for positive training for horses. This is a field that in some parts of the industry gets a lot of flack, and in other parts of the industry tends to be ignored. And I really feel that it's an untapped resource. I feel that if you're owning an animal like a horse, the more you know, the better. The more tools you have in your toolbox, the better. We're going to discuss some of those things today and where positive reinforcement sort of fits into the traditional horsemanship that you may already be familiar with. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I consider myself sort of an advocate for this type of training with horses because it is incredible. So this is a slide that just shows some of the opportunities that I've been able to have as a zookeeper. I'm not going to go into this in detail. I just wanted to show. And then these are some of the animal ambassadors that I have now. So you can see the types of animals I have experience training. This is my guinea fowl, George. This is my mouse, Moose, when he was a little baby. My macaw, Fuego, who you may, just as a heads up here in the background, because I'm currently in the area where she lives at the moment. So if you hear a loud squawk, I apologize, that's her. I raised a litter of Belgian Malinois puppies for a friend of mine who does conservation work. They were raised to be anti-poaching dogs in Africa. And one of the things that I did first with these puppies was I taught them all to sit. So here they all are demonstrating sitting for you. And then I also taught a goat to sit while I was working at the safari park. And these are a goat and a sheep that I have now working on halter training with them. And I have reptiles. My snakes are actually behind me right now. And then, of course, the horses. And again, these two are actually my case studies, so I'll talk about them in a lot more depth a little while later on. And this is my little mini Ziggy when I took him to Staples, the office superstore. So, all right, let's get started. First thing we're going to do is a very basic breakdown of the science behind training. I do want to emphasize before we go through this, this may be information you already know, or it may be information that you've heard elsewhere. It is also the very, very, very tip of the iceberg. The more you learn about training, the more you learn you don't know, in my experience. So we're not going to cover everything tonight. It's just not possible. But we are going to cover the basics. And hopefully tonight you'll leave with an idea of where to go from here, or at least something that you can work on at home. So what is operant conditioning? Operant conditioning is the animal learning theory that was developed by B.F. Skinner in the 1930s. You've all heard of Pavlov's classical conditioning, the dog where when he would ring a bell, it would salivate because it was anticipating a treat or food. That is a sort of a stimulus, which is what we call sort of the input to the animals, a stimulus or a cue, that created a reflex or the biological response of the dog salivating, which is out of their control. Operant conditioning seeks to describe and explain intentional or voluntary behavior, so things that the animal consciously, to use a word, chooses to do. Classical and operant conditioning can work with each other to shape learning, but today we are going to focus on operant conditioning. So operant conditioning essentially breaks down into 4 quadrants that I've described here. You have positive and negative, reinforcement, and punishment. Positive means to add something to an animal's environment, and this is very important. You're going to hear me use the words positive and negative a lot tonight, and with one exception, I am entirely referring to these technical descriptions and not necessarily the other meaning that they have for a lot of people, which is that positive being something good or negative being something bad. That's not always the case. This is just a technical description of these types of shaping behavior. So negative is removing something from an animal's environment. Reinforcement means to encourage a behavior, and punishment means to discourage a behavior. So then you get to where these elements interact with each other. You have positive punishment, which is where you're adding something to an animal's environment to discourage a behavior. An example of that is using a whip when your horse kicks or bucks. Negative punishment is removing something from an animal's environment to discourage a behavior. An example of that would be taking away your horse's bucket of grain when they kick the rail. Positive reinforcement is to add something to an animal's environment to encourage a behavior. So feeding your horse a treat when they stop on command. And negative reinforcement is to remove something from an animal's environment to encourage a behavior, which is, for example, relieving pressure with your legs or on the reins when your horse goes, stops, or turns as asked. Now you may be asking, okay, well, what about these other types of training that I know of? For example, recently in like the last 15, 20 years, people have been moving away from what we consider sort of the traditional horsemanship techniques into this more new age and natural horsemanship technique. And we'll talk about both of those and how they sort of interplay with the other things that we just discussed. Traditional horsemanship, thankfully, I feel personally, is going the way of the dodo. That was a lot of correction, right? That's where, whips, hard bits, spurs, lunging, hitting, yelling, all kind of came from. You may still use some of those tools today. I will talk about that in a minute. I'm not necessarily saying that there is never a place for those items, but what we're going to be focusing on is building behaviors. People who use traditional horsemanship talk a lot about horses being broken to ride. And again, we still use that phrase today. It's very common. There's a lot of talk of teaching horses lessons. It's very retaliatory, very aggressive. Whereas New Age natural horsemanship still uses a lot of tools. There's sometimes whips used as well, although more in like a cueing or space creating way. A lot of ropes, knotted halters, lots of lunging, lots of discussing with pressure. Instead of being broken, horses are started, which I honestly appreciate that we've had that language shift, right? There's a lot of talk of speaking the language of the horse, which I also appreciate because I do think we need to take into consideration that these animals have a natural history. We can't just ignore that when we're interacting with them. And in the wrong hands, just like traditional horsemanship, This stuff can still be retaliatory and aggressive, especially if someone is using it to kind of disguise the old methods. So that's what I caution people to look out for when they're looking at natural horsemanship, is just make sure that the technique that you're using isn't just disguising something that we used to do that way. So going back to that chart that we just discussed a few minutes ago, traditional horsemanship is mostly based on positive punishment, and I consider it reactive training, which I'll explain in a minute. New Age or natural horsemanship is mostly based on negative reinforcement. There's some negative punishment too, but a lot of it is negative reinforcement, and I consider it constructive training, which again, I'll explain in a minute. So this tends to raise a moral dilemma for a lot of people, which is, how do I train my horse then, right? Like there's all these techniques that I learned. Can I use them? What do I do with this specific horse? What if my horse is aggressive? What if my horse isn't listening? And I'm going to tell you, I'm not the person to answer that question for you. For me, the answer is however the two of you can work together in a way that's safe and that's most positive for everyone involved, while offering your horse as much choice as you can in their care, training, handling, and enrichment. Regardless of how you choose to proceed, it can be difficult to change your mindset and your horse's mindset when it comes to the way you're training. Approaching new training challenges with the perspective of building what you want to see instead of breaking down what you don't is a really helpful way to look at problems. Horses aren't different from other animals that are commonly trained with positive reinforcement, but the way that we interact with them is. We don't ride our dogs. In zoos, we don't ride the animals there. Like we as humans, we put ourselves in a very close proximity, trust requiring situation with horses that we don't do with a ton of other animals that we use positive reinforcement commonly for. So it's kind of up to you to decide where to draw the lines. That said, you want to be wary of learned helplessness, which is a situation where the horse has not been trained, but instead has accepted defeat. Learned helplessness generally seems like a success in the short term, but it will typically lead to continued issues with that behavior over time and resurgences of the behavior when it may be dangerous or particularly inconvenient. A common behavior that's taught through learned helplessness in horses is tying, but many natural horsemanship techniques also rely on learned helplessness to achieve their flashy results. Now, I'm talking specifically about natural horsemanship trainers who are like, I can break a colt in 30 minutes, right? They're relying on learned helplessness to accomplish that. If you are taking your time and natural horsemanship is working for you, fine, great. I'm talking mostly, though, about when you're creating these big changes in a very short amount of time. It's not necessarily lasting change. Learned helplessness can also result in long-term trust issues with your horse. If the relationship is what you treasure, learned helplessness will sour it. So then why do we use positive reinforcement? Despite its name being merely a technical description of the method, positive reinforcement is, frankly, more positive. Zoos primarily use this tactic to train their animals for good reason. Animals trained with positive reinforcement exhibit less stress, more natural behaviors, and are easier to manage. It creates long-term solutions. By building behaviors, you are essentially giving the animal the stepping stones it needs to succeed instead of just creating a situation where they may or may not be successful. It builds a better relationship and therefore more trust. And it's neither reactive nor constructive, but rather proactive. And so the best analogy I can give you for reactive, constructive, or proactive training is train tracks. So I consider reactive training building the tracks after the train drove by, right? So we talk about that old traditional horsemanship where you wait for your horse to do something wrong and then you correct it. So you're riding and your horse bucks and you kick them until they stop, or whatever that solution is, right? The train has gone. The train has left the station. That behavior has already happened, and now you're addressing it. I would consider New Age and natural horsemanship, some of the techniques, not necessarily all, a lot of them are constructive, which means you're building the tracks as the train is driving along them, kind of putting the boards down in front of the train as it goes, right? Like you're asking the horse to give you the opportunity to correct behaviors. And again, Doesn't apply to everything. It does apply to some. And then finally, proactive training, which is what I consider positive reinforcement, is building the tracks before the train gets to you so that you have that mile to drive on before you have to worry about building more. How do you start using positive reinforcement? Well, as I discussed in the beginning, it would take a really long time to go through all of the theory needed to train completely, but I will give you a model behavior in a little bit for the sake of a jumping off point. Remember that positive reinforcement means adding something to an animal's environment to encourage a behavior. And perhaps the most frustrating, but also the easiest part of positive reinforcement is that you have to train your animal to be trained. There's a couple things they need to know before you can start working on other things. And the good news is they're fairly simple to do. So the first thing, they must learn a bridge, which we'll go over in a minute, and they must learn how to accept reinforcement, which we'll go over again. What is a reinforcer? There are both primary and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are something the animal receives directly: food, scritches, a toy, something that is motivating to them, okay, something they want. Secondary reinforcers are trained by pairing them with a primary reinforcer. A bridge, which again I'll explain in a minute, falls under this category. For horses, by far the most common reinforcer is treats. The rest of this lecture, I will be doing everything through the lens of offering food as the reinforcer because that's what I use, that's what's successful for me. But I encourage you to be creative, especially if you have a horse that's insulin resistant or too mouthy around treats, or otherwise, if that's not a good jumping off point for you, that's fine. Find something else. Just find something that's motivating. And we'll talk about some different motivators in a second, but don't feel like just because I'm giving you food examples, that's what you have to do. Some horses work for, sorry, I skipped one. Small pieces of carrot or apple work too. Some horses work for pellets or chopped hay. If you do need to find a low sugar treat you can use. You can also use scritches, toys, or whatever else they find motivating. If it's ending the session is motivating, work on these things at the very end and then put them home. What is a bridge? A bridge, quite simply, bridges the gap in time between when an animal performs the desired behavior and when it receives the reinforcer. If you've ever used a clicker, you're familiar with a bridge. Timing is important. You have to bridge at the exact right moment so you don't confuse the horse or reinforce the wrong behavior. Bridges are very easy to train. You can associate them with a primary reinforcer in short, fast sessions. This is actually one of my favorite exercises to do with a new horse. When I get to them, the first thing I do is I teach a bridge. And what I do is I take, a handful of cookies. As I said, my perspective is through the lens of food rewards. So I take a handful of cookies and I offer it to them and I say, good girl or good boy or good horse or whatever the bridge is that I'm going to use with a specific animal, as I'm handing them the cookie. And I do that over and over and over again. And what you're doing is you're creating that association between the cookie being received and them hearing those words. I do use a verbal bridge because I can use it anywhere at any time, but you can use a clicker, a touch, a sound, a motion, anything that you can consistently offer. I just like verbal bridges because if I left my clicker at home and I'm working with my horse and she does something that I want to capture, all I have to do is say, good girl, and she gets it. So it just depends on what you want to use, do what works for you, but that's my personal favorite. So again, training a bridge, fairly easy. You just offer the reinforcer over and over again while you're saying the bridge, and eventually they come to associate the bridge with the reinforcer, and that's how you train that secondary reinforcement. Now, training your animal to accept reinforcement, especially if it's food. Chances are, if you aren't big on hand feeding treats, suddenly starting will cause a great deal of interest on the part of your horse. This is by far the biggest complaint I get when I try to convince horse people to try positive reinforcement. I usually hear that they tried it before and it didn't work because their horse was super pushy or too worried about the treats, and that's totally fair. I will warn you, you will go through a period of this if it's new. What I usually do is consistently, gently ask them to stay out of my space while I have the food and only allow them into my space or to have the food once they've stopped asking. And that will eventually get through. If your horse responds to the refusal for you to give them food with aggression, By all means, end the session and therefore the opportunity to earn more reinforcement. You don't have to stop there for the day. We use a technique a lot called timeouts in the zoo, and I use it as well with my animals here. A timeout is just you step back and you take 10 or 15 minutes away from the animal. You are not offering them the opportunity to earn reinforcement, but then if you want to, you can give them the chance to try again. I would say if you're getting escalating aggression, stop there and consult something, whether it's me or a book, but don't let aggression rehearse itself, right? So you can lessen this neediness, though, in a protected contact situation, which just means through the bars of their stall, for example, by gradually lengthening the time between reinforcements, but only reinforcing if they wait patiently. So if it was me and I was standing in front of my horse's stall and they were sticking their head through the bars trying to get to me because I had food, I would wait until they relaxed their body language, and then I would offer them the reinforcement. So now for a sample behavior, learning colors. So let's say you want to teach your horse to differentiate between two identical but differently colored dog toys, one blue and one green, which are colors that horses can see. That's in the spectrum of their vision. Begin by choosing one of the toys, it doesn't really matter which, and holding it up to your horse. You want to encourage them to touch it. If they sniff it and touch it accidentally, take it. That's great, that's perfect. That's called capturing, when they do the behavior you want them to do, whether it's intentional or not. Then you offer them your bridge and your reinforce. So if I was holding out the blue ball to my horse and she touched it, I would say immediately, the second she touches it, good girl, pull the ball back, give her a cookie. And then you repeat that process. And when they're touching it on their own, so if I'm, again, holding up the blue ball and she reaches out to touch it purposefully, that's when I would bridge and reinforce. And once I get to that point, then I'm also going to add my verbal cue, whatever I want that to be. Technically, holding up the ball is a cue, but if you want them to be able to do it at a distance, add a verbal cue to it as well, or sight cue, whatever you want to do. I use touch green or touch blue with my horse. Yes, this is a behavior I've trained. That's why I'm using it as an example. Repeat again and again until they consistently touch it when you say the cue. At this time, do not teach the other color. We're going to pretend that other color doesn't exist for right now because we're trying to teach them to differentiate between the two. Instead, when your horse is consistently touching the toy when cued, you want to bring that other toy up and hold it parallel to the one you've been working with, but just as a neutral object. And then you're going to ask your horse to touch the same toy you've been working with. So if you've been working with the blue one, you hold the blue and the green one next to each other, and then ask the horse to touch the blue one again. This is where timing and consistency will either shorten or lengthen your time to success. If the horse picks the wrong toy, use an LRS, which is a least reinforcing scenario. I'll explain that in a second, and then try again. If they pick the right toy, you want to bridge and reinforce right away. And I know this is a lot of like dry sciencey stuff. I promise it'll get more interesting in a few minutes. We just have to go through kind of the details here. So I'm also teaching a lot of vocab right now. Least reinforcing scenario is when you essentially, you don't want to like yell and scream when your horse gets something wrong, right? Because some animals find that reinforcing. They're like, oh, you know, I stepped on his toe and then he did this funny dance. That's great. That's fun. I want to do that again. Instead, you make yourself as least reinforcing as you can. And what that usually means is you would turn your head away, break eye contact, kind of slump down a little bit, maybe look at the ground for 5 to 15 seconds to make it clear that the animal did not make the correct choice. You don't offer, you don't offer punishment, you don't offer reinforcement, you are just a neutral object existing in the same space. They aren't having the chance to earn reinforcement, and then you try again. And you repeat that process. If they pick the right toy, bridge and reinforce right away. And then you repeat that process until they're consistently choosing the right toy. And then you can repeat the whole process with the other color. When it comes time to ask the horse to pick between the two toys, you can test their understanding of the concept by randomizing which color you ask them to touch. So my primary horse and I have a shorthand for most training scenarios now, and she actually prefers another vocab word, a delta to an LRS. A delta is kind of a shortcut. I'm probably not explaining this perfectly correctly, but basically it's instead of being less reinforcing, it's telling the animal that they didn't do the right thing. So for me, I use try again. That's my delta phrase with my horse. Common training pitfalls. Watch for human bias or unintended cues. In the case of the colors, be careful not to look at the correct toy or put it closer to the horse unintentionally so that they come to choose based on that information instead of learning which color you're looking for. In my horse, this behavior is fairly advanced, but to combat any bias on my part, I just toss the balls randomly and then I ask her to go to the correct color. You want to make sure that you're patient when you're training. Often right when I'm wondering why I haven't been successful yet, I hit a breakthrough. It's always something I'm doing wrong, by the way. And then the timing. I can't really stress enough how much timing will help or hinder you. This is why people prefer clickers, because they quickly mark the correct behavior. They don't work well for me, but they do work for a lot of people for many reasons. So I'm not disparaging them. It's just I personally prefer a verbal bridge. Now for some common horse issues positive reinforcement can solve. These are honestly my favorites, but really the sky's the limit. If you can think of something that your horse is doing that's bothering you, chances are it can be solved by positive reinforcement. So, gate crashing or turnout runaways. So this is when, you know, if you open your horse's stall door or as you're leading them in, right, they like crash out of it by you. If you have the opportunity, if you're at the type of facility where your turnout is attached to your stall and you open the stall and they bolt through it to get by you into the turnout. Or when you're leading your horse to the turnout and you stop at the gate to unhalter them or even just unclip the lead rope and they spin and kick and almost smack you in the face with their hind legs. Those are all behaviors that are actually fairly simple to fix, honestly. Pardon me. I have a lot of success with this with multiple horses. So the old method, when you want to go to fix this behavior, you hold on for dear life. You yank on or whip the horse with the lead rope until they stop. You might ask them to go back into and out of the gate over and over and over again until they figure it out. Or you can get in their space until they retreat respectfully from yours. But with positive reinforcement, you make the gate the goal, not what's past it. Again, I use food primarily, so I use cookies to create interest in me. I want myself to be the most interesting part of this situation, not the gate or being turned out. And you can bring your horse to the gate and reinforce strongly there. And let's see. This is a YouTube video, so hopefully it will work. But this is a video that I put up on a YouTube channel that I was starting about gate crashers. So it's almost 3 minutes long. We'll go ahead and watch the whole thing because it explains this fix and demonstrates it really clearly. All right. See if I can get, there we go. PowerPoint presentation back. Okay, there we go. All right. So real quickly for that video, that was within 2 sessions, right? That he was considering the gate, the opportunity instead of what lay past it. So it works really fast. I use the same technique with my personal mare. We'll talk about her in a little while. She used to be one of those ones who would yank away from you when you went to turn her out and would spin and kick. Now she stands and waits for me to remove her halter, her lead rope, even close and shut the gate. And as soon as I turn my body to the side, that's her cue that it's okay to leave, and then she does. So another thing positive reinforcement can fix is standing for injections. Your horse may be used to them already. Mine wasn't. I finally decided to train it like we do in zoos to, for husbandry behaviors for a lot of animals, we'll train them to willingly accept injections or draw blood. So I trained my mare recently on standing for injections. The old method again, what options did you have, right? You yank on the lead rope until the horse stands still and then jump out of the way when they inevitably startle. You can increase the pressure when they move away from the needle, release it when they move closer. With positive reinforcement, you begin by approaching the horse with an empty syringe with no needle on it. You reinforce for them allowing you to do so. You want to touch them in the areas where they'd commonly receive injections with that needle and reinforce. And then you would draw back the plunger and do the same thing. And then eventually you get up to mimicking giving them this injection. And then you can repeat with a safety pin or another safe object to simulate needle pressure. So this was what I did with my mare. I know her very well, and I used a blunt, heavy gauge needle to teach this behavior, but I'm going to put the caveat of not attempting it at home because if she had startled, she could have theoretically been punctured even though it was a blunt needle. So just keep that in mind if you decide to train this type of behavior. But you can see on the left there is me mimicking an intramuscular injection, and then on the right is me mimicking an intravenous injection. And again, I mentioned earlier, the sky's kind of the limit. If you can think of a behavior that would be bettered by positive reinforcement, I can probably think of a way for you to teach your horse. Bridling, saddling, grooming, and farrier. I have done all of these things with horses. I'm not going to go into too many details because we would be here all day. But, you know, with the old methods, you can physically attempt to restrain the horse, and you succeed or you don't. Yanking on the lead rope, you know, again, it's the same options, walking in circles, whatever it is. Increasing pressure when they appear to be resisting, lessen it when they're cooperating. With positive reinforcement, you can teach your horse to put their mouth on the bit, then open it, then accept it. And again, same thing, you can reinforce each stage of saddling, reinforce each stage of grooming, reinforce each stage of getting their feet done. It just takes some creativity. And here I am with that same horse teaching her to accept the bridle. She already did fine without it, but it was something that I would have to wait, you know, 2 or 3 times for her to finish kind of shaking her head away from the bit before she would settle in and do it. So I made the decision to teach her with positive reinforcement instead. Now, I did mention earlier that I have been forced to kind of shift my personal interests away from riding in the past couple of years, but positive reinforcement can help you in the saddle too. If you already ride bitless or with a grazing bit, you can, with good enough balance, feed reinforcers directly from the saddle. With that same horse that you saw a minute ago, I fixed a mounting block issue in her by feeding carrots after I got on. If you use a non-food reinforcer such as scratches and praise, you can use those at any time. And finally, even if you do feed food and it's not ideal to feed while you're riding, you can use your secondary reinforcer once trained, which is your bridge. So if you teach your horse good girl or a clicker sound, you can use those while you're riding. They'll have to wait longer for their primary reinforcer, but you can, once they're up to speed on how things work, ride a whole session using only your bridge and then offer a big reward at the end. I like to end every ride with their grain bucket or a bran mash on hot or really difficult days. And now it's time for my case studies. So we're going to start with this girl, Tally. And she is my primary horse, my personal horse. She's 20 years old. I've known her since she was a yearling, but I've only owned her since she was 6. She is naturally a fearful and reactive horse, and to be completely honest, I've had many accidents with her, a few of which have put me in the hospital. Her sensitivity, though, is what prompted my real dive into using positive reinforcement with horses. At this point, we are 2 halves of a whole. We speak each other's language very well, and she frequently picks up new things within a few tries. She knows over 40 cued behaviors, 2 colors, and desenses to new items quickly. This behavior is one that I've actually only started teaching her recently, even though it's been on my list for a very long time, which is a targeted recall at speed. So I had an assistant lead her to the other side of the arena and then release her over there and practiced her coming back to me at a run instead of just sort of ambling along. And then here we are, we were desensing to the flag. So you can see that she's letting me walk all the way around and behind her with this flag waving around. And here is the color behavior that I mentioned earlier. So you can see I have the green and the blue dog toys. They're called holy rollers if you want to look for the same ones for yourself. But she not only knows how to tell which one is which, but she'll actually pick up the appropriate ball. She also interacts with this large ball. She knows to push it with her face. So I had these poles up because I was kind of playing around with the idea of teaching her to play soccer, but I haven't finished that behavior yet. I have been teaching her to self-load into the trailer as well. This is also an incomplete behavior right now because I recently got my own trailer, which is a different style, so I have to teach her again. But you can see this is a still from a video session that she's going in on her own while I'm staying back. And then this one doesn't make much sense to look at, but if you look at the ground underneath her front feet, you can kind of see that dark square. That's a black rubber mat that I use as a mark. So what I teach her with that is, again, like for those behaviors where she's, for example, running across the arena toward me, the goal would be for her to stop on the mark so that I can send and recall her from different parts of the arena, and she would go to the mark. Whether at speed or at a walk is as yet to be determined. But this is kind of the movie style training that you see people doing whenever you're watching a movie or a show and there's a beautiful lone horse with no humans running across an open field for a long period of time. Chances are it's this behavior that you're seeing. This horse was trained to run to their trainer at the other end. They were released from one end, trained to run to the other, and they stop at a station or a mark. All right. So the next case study is Buttercup. And Buttercup had kind of a sad story. This is her, though. So I bought her in December of 2020 as a lesson horse. She was perfect when we went to see her. I lunged her, and this is important. I picked up all 4 feet, and my friend got on and rode her, and she was wonderful for him. We brought her home, and she was almost instantaneously a different horse. And she was frankly dangerous. My friend went to go put some acclimation rides on her to get her kind of used to our place. And the first session, she tried cow kicking at him when anytime he went basically past her withers, and biting him when he tried to touch her. Even interacting with me in her stall and my employees when they were cleaning and feeding, her ears were constantly back. And when you did lunge her, she would run in the round pen with her head constantly tilted toward one side or the other. So the vet came out and figured out that she was mostly blind in her right eye and partially blind in her left. We determined that this hadn't happened, like it didn't happen after I bought her, but it had been degenerative, and that this is likely where her aggression was coming from, because she was all of a sudden in a new place with new people and she had no trust in any of us. She didn't know the facility, she didn't know the people, she didn't know what to expect. So I think that was 2 or 3 weeks after I got her that I immediately discounted her as a lesson horse and changed my goal instead to give her the skills to cope with her blindness long term and then find her a new home since she couldn't stay in my lesson barn. So my first session with Buttercup involved getting her to accept me touching her without getting kicked. I decided to do this with protected contact. So you'll see what I mean in a minute. There's a large turnout down at my lesson barn where you saw that video of me teaching the horse not to run through the gate. So I would release her into the turnout and then go on the outside of the fence and work with her there. And that way she couldn't kick me if she decided to be defensive. I used a lot of reinforcement. She was very food motivated. And for the first session, this is kind of funny, but it worked. I duct taped a work glove to the end of a lunge whip and used that to be able to touch her hips and back from a distance, and then reinforced her for allowing the contact. By the fourth session, she was letting me groom her with standard grooming tools through the fence all over her body. And then after that, I was able to capture a side presenting cue on each side. And so she would lay her body flat against the fence on each side and turn around and present the other side when I asked, so that I could manipulate things from outside the fence. So this is the type of behavior that we were dealing with. This is from a video I took of our first session. You know, she's just approaching the fence to me immediately in that defensive posture with her ears back, right? She's ready to say, like, don't you dare do what I don't want you to do. This was the fourth session. I'm currying her on the side right now. You can see she still has her ears back. Her mouth was open. She was leaning back. I worked with her a lot like this, and over time I came to actually realize that this was just her. It looks aggressive, but she was just checking to see what I was doing, because that was this eye that had sight. So eventually, like later in our sessions, I don't know if any of the video I have shows it, but you'll see she'll be doing this 2 inches from my face, and I don't flinch because I grew to trust her even though she was still showing me these aggressive signs. So this is the side presenting cue. Again, it looks aggressive. It looks like she's trying to swing her butt over to kick me, but I had actually asked her to do that and then allow me to touch her with the metal curry comb. In the continued sessions with the side presenting cue, I was able to manipulate her feet. It took me a long time for her to let me pick up her hind feet, but she did. Neither of my farriers would touch her, so I had to help her throw her shoes through the fence. Eventually, I was able to get her old farrier to come out, and she let him give her a trim. Though she was a challenge, Buttercup had a lot of potential. She was a fast learner and very eager to participate in our sessions. I decided to see if there was a magical home out there somewhere looking for her. So this is me when I was able to finally start manipulating her feet through the fence again. Sorry, these are cutting off so quickly. They're all GIFs because it was the only way I could load so many videos into the PowerPoint. So they're very short loops, just 5 seconds. And then we worked on building confidence for the long term. My goal wasn't to get Buttercup out of my hands. It was to give her the skills and confidence she would need to navigate a lifetime of sight loss without the aggression she displayed with us. So I did a lot of descents for vision loss, specifically with the flag and other obscurations of her vision. I really like the flag as a descents tool in general, but I loved it for this situation with Buttercup because it worked on sort of continuing the things that made her defensive. She would, you know, there's lots of fluttering, lots of light and dark, lots of movement. I worked on touching her while the flag was covering her face. Again, it was her choice to participate in these sessions. I trained her to accept the flag over her face and then worked on touching her too. And I also began doing sessions at twilight and after dark. I'm normally a very visual trainer. I combine verbal and visual cues quite often, but when you're dealing with a horse that's getting ready to go blind, I had to sort of rein myself in as far as being more aware of needing to use verbal cues instead, although she did still pick up on a couple visual cues because none of us are perfect. So this is me. I think this is only our second or third session desensing with the flag. This was before I put it over her, started putting it over her body, but you can see that she's very comfortable with it, honestly. I was pleasantly surprised again by how quickly she picked things up. And then reteaching manners in her new world. So finally, near the end of her stay with me, pardon me, I began working with her on leading and groundwork again, though still all protected contact. I did have free contact with Buttercup, but usually during downtime or while I was busy working on something in her stall or the turnout. For formal sessions where food was involved, I chose to continue protected contact only because I knew what she was capable of, and it wasn't worth my safety to take that chance. I taught her to shift out of her stall when I entered it, so we weren't sharing that space. And then I would halter her and lead her through the fence, working on stopping with a verbal cue, turning to stay with me, and backing up in line with me, again on a verbal cue. She picked all of this up so quickly, I was also able to ask for these things off of the lead rope, and she would flawlessly comply. So here she is, turning to match me. And I taught her present and then present right. So I taught her the present cue because she was offering me her left side first, since that's the side she was comfortable with. And then I was able to get her to mirror it on the right-hand side. I just added the right to the cue. So that way they would be differentiated so she'd know which side I meant, since I couldn't use a visual cue to tell her which direction to face. Although you'll notice here, as I mentioned, I did turn myself around as well. That was just a habit that we fell into. And this is her backing up with me with no lead rope or halter. Just again on the verbal cue. So Buttercup did have a happy, though different ending than I expected. There were no takers for her, unfortunately. I might have been a little too honest in her ad, but I was actually a bit relieved because despite how much I'd bonded with her and how much I wanted to keep her myself, she was a liability to have here, and I was very worried that someone would take her who would not be prepared for everything she had to offer and they could get badly hurt, or that she would wind up somewhere that wasn't good for her despite the precautions I was taking. So I came across a horse sanctuary in the mountains when the owner reached out to me about a different horse, and she thankfully agreed to take Buttercup, and we delivered her there in early June. And the good news is she'll be safe there for the rest of her life without the pressure of having to interact with people beyond getting her feet trimmed and being fed and having her stall cleaned. And this is her trotting across one of the several giant pastures that they have the day that we took her to the sanctuary. All right, so the next question is, where do we go from here? And so my answer to that is that this is only the beginning in a general sense. The future of animal training and husbandry, especially in the zoological industry, is focusing on providing animals with freedom and the ability to choose. To me, this is the goal for horses too, although, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is kind of a moral dilemma there, right? With, like, well, we choose to keep these animals so that we can ride them and do these interactions with them. And I'm not going to get into the philosophy debate now. It's a little too much for this talk. But we want to look for opportunities to provide those things for our horses in their daily lives where we can. There have been some interesting studies done that have shown that horses can decide if they want to be blanketed or not. So the fact that they have the capacity to make those decisions for themselves is really interesting to me, and it shows that there are other opportunities there for us to learn what they want and don't want and to work with them in that regard. I'm working on a study of my own about choice-based activities that I'm eager to explore. I'm going to be, teaching Tally her colors was a foundational behavior of this study that I'm sort of undertaking as a personal mission. And then more specifically, today is only the beginning because, as I've mentioned a few times, the sky is the limit. I still learn new things from my animals every day about them, about training, about horses in general. There really is no end to things that can be learned there. What we went over today is really only the very tip of the iceberg, but there are wonderful resources out there if you want to learn more. And then just to plug myself, I do consult, and on request, I offer training classes to individuals or groups. If you have a specific problem you're trying to solve and you want me to teach you how, you can reach out for more info. My email address is my first name, Lessa, at my ranch name, ironoakcanyonranch.com. And you can find more of what we offer at our website, which is www.ironoakcanyonranch.com as well. All right. We finished a little earlier than I intended, but we'll have plenty of time for questions if there are any. Let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen so we can do that.
I will mention too that Amelia will be sending your contact information in the follow-up email to everyone. So if you didn't catch that, you'll get it in a follow-up along with the recording too. So if you don't feel like, oh, you wanted to kind of regroup and rewatch and really kind of watch what Lessa was showing, you'll have that opportunity too. We'll send you the video. So no questions? Comments?
You can, if you don't feel comfortable unmuting yourself, you can type them into the chat as well.
So I'll just ask you a question. How did she do, like how quickly did it take her to, after the last horse was homed at the sanctuary, for her just to feel comfortable and confident and not regress into what was happening when you first got her?
So they're very hands-off there.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't really heard that they've been having problems with aggression with her, thankfully. Mm-hmm. But they also take a very, these horses aren't here to be interacting with humans, they're here to be horses approach, which was one of the big reasons I was so interested in sending her there, because I think that's what she needs. Like, she was dangerous enough that at some point the option for her would have been euthanasia. So I was really delighted to find a facility that was going to take that pressure of interacting with, the opportunity of interacting with humans to a minimum, so that she didn't have to get to the point where she needed that solution.
Oh, Veronica, you know what? This is something that I just learned too, because I'm from the old school days with the big, thick halters. And that's all I ever knew until I recently learned about the knotted halters. So can you explain the benefits of the knotted halters?
Sure. So a lot of the more modern horsemanship trainers and people use what they're called rope halters. And I wish I was just looking around my office to see if I had one in here, but I don't. They're, instead of being, as Elke mentioned, like sort of the big, thicker nylon bands or leather strips, they're pieces of rope, basically, usually doubled up, but that's it. And then there's usually knots across the nose. For ones that are a little harsher, they'll also include them along the pole, kind of behind the ears. And the thought is, and you have to tie it on too, which is the part that I always struggle with because I don't use them very often, instead of using a buckle. The thought is that it gives you more control of the horse when they're in the halter specifically. So
let me see.
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of people use it as a training technique or a training tool instead of just a halter.
Do you see that?
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, they're very basic. And then what I also learned was there's some that don't have the knots around the nose, but we like the ones on the nose, right? Because it's their pressure points. It helps with the pressure.
Yeah. So natural horsemanship, they talk a lot. There's many trainers that do natural horsemanship. I'm kind of lumping them all in together, but like Pirelli, Clinton Anderson, Buck Brannaman, all those guys kind of tend to use the same language. They talk a lot about like creating and releasing pressure. So the thought with the rope halter is that if the horse has pressure on their nose, they're less likely to do things like charge ahead of you or walk away when you ask them to stop, that kind of thing. So it's kind of like a bit in that it's a piece of equipment that goes around, or in the case of a bit, inside their mouth, right? And it creates a cue in and of itself, and how the horse is reinforced or punished to increase or decrease the behavior you do or don't want them to do is by escaping that pressure. So if you're leading your horse in a rope halter and you want them to stop, you would pull backwards on the lead rope to put pressure on the nose, and by stopping, the horse releases that pressure. That's how they work as a training tool. Good question.
Yeah, she says we've seen them, but thought it was a simple halter. Yeah.
Yeah. I will caution you, if you have a horse that's very sensitive about their face and you don't have a rope halter for them, don't get one. My mare, the Tally, the first one that I talked about in the case studies, I think I put a rope halter on her exactly one time because I was curious what everyone was talking about. And she like flew backward out of my hands because it was too much face pressure for her. So just keep that in mind. If you don't have a horse that needs that, it may be too harsh of a tool for them, but they are useful in certain situations.
Anybody else? Are we going to have an early night tonight?
When I was making my PowerPoint last night, I was like, wow, 68 slides, I should stop. Now I regret not going more.
Well, this is usually, I think usually we do allow for at least 20 minutes of question and answer just in case, but I feel like the fact that everyone can go back and watch is very helpful. So you have that information there, having Lessa's contact information. Catherine says it was a great presentation. She doesn't have any questions, so thank you. And you know, if it's new, and if it's new to everyone, this will just get you started, right? And just get you thinking about it. And maybe know, I mean, you know, the internet, you know, just being careful with who you're watching and what you're watching, or you know, reaching out to Lessa. She might have some thoughts on how to expand on this knowledge.
Yes, I will say one thing I put in the, I didn't put in the PowerPoint, I almost did, but I haven't, this is showing my flag a little bit here, I haven't actually read it myself, I keep meaning to, but a book that I hear a lot of people recommend quite a bit for an introduction to positive reinforcement is Karen Pryor's Don't Shoot the Dog. Is it Don't Shoot the Dog? You might know, Elke, I might be mixing that up. I think that's what it's called. But that one is a really fantastic introduction to positive reinforcement in general. So if you're looking for something that's a little more in depth than what I went over here, and to address some of the common issues that come up when you first start trying positive reinforcement, that is it's Don't Shoot the Dog, The New Art of Teaching and Training. That's an excellent place to start. You might have to get a little creative to figure out how to apply it to your horse, because obviously their behavior is a little different than dogs. But again, as I said, for quick questions, I don't charge a consultation fee. If you wanted me to like help walk you through a training plan for a specific issue, or if you wanted me to consult, like physically come out and help you solve a problem, I do charge consultation fees for that. But if you just have a quick question on something, or if you want to clarify something we went over tonight after this presentation is over, feel free to reach out by email. I love talking about training, as you can tell. I'd be more than happy to help.
And of course, if this is something that's new to you just in general, I think I see one of our trainers on the call today, Margaret. We do have actually a free helpline as well, behavior helpline for our companion animals, mostly dogs and cats, but they can help with others as well. So, and that's behavior@sdhumane.org. You know, again, talking about positive reinforcement and how that can work for your companion animals. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Be on the lookout for Amelia's follow-up, which will give you Lessa's contact information. We appreciate you being here today. Thank you, Lessa.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Bye-bye.